Moria was more determined than ever. After last year's defeat at the Chicken Town Market, where Clever's tiny pumpkins had stolen the show, and the possibility of losing her cat Daniel Thorne, she was consumed with a single goal: to beat him once and for all. She retreated into her cottage, focusing all of her magical energy on creating a potion unlike any other. A potion that would not just grow a better crop but would outshine anything Clever could produce. But as Moria worked late into the night, something strange began to happen. The more energy she poured into her potion, the brighter her hair became. It wasn't a subtle change, it glowed, radiating light so bright it could blind anyone who looked at it directly. It shimmered like the sun, casting harsh rays all over her dim cottage. Daniel Thorne, ever watchful, squinted from a dark corner, unimpressed. "You're literally glowing," he muttered. "Maybe you should stop before you blind yourself." Moria laughed, dismissing his concern. "This is nothing compared to what I'm about to accomplish. This year, I'll have the grandest pumpkins anyone has ever seen." Ignoring her increasingly radiant hair, Moria poured the last of her magical energy into the potion. She then rushed outside to pour it over her pumpkin patch. She expected not only a bountiful harvest of perfect pumpkins, but to win it all once and for all. When suddenly something unexpected happened. As the potion soaked into the soil, all of the energy concentrated in one spot. The ground began to rumble, and before her eyes, a single pumpkin began to grow larger and larger, until it looked like a large boulder. Moria stepped back, shielding her eyes from the blinding light reflecting off her own hair. As the pumpkin grew to an enormous size, it was easily the largest pumpkin the village had ever seen. Daniel Thorne padded outside and looked up at the giant fruit, his eyes half-lidded with unimpressed amusement. "Well, you've outdone yourself," he said dryly. "Did you mean to create such a large pumpkin?" he asked. "And now how are you going to get that to the market?" He added, "Of course I meant to create this enormous monstrosity. I have to think outside the box, you know, in order to beat him," she said. But in fact Moria had no idea what she had done. Squinting through the golden light of her hair, frowned. The pumpkin was far too large for any carriage. "I'll use magic, of course," she muttered, irritated. "How else?" When the day of the Chicken Town Market arrived, Moria used her powers to levitate the massive pumpkin and transport it to the village. She floated above the streets with the pumpkin trailing behind her, hovering in the air like a great orange balloon. The villagers stopped and stared as she arrived, their mouths agape at the sheer size of the pumpkin. It was a spectacle for sure, something no one had ever seen before. It was hard to see because they were blinded by her hair. Moria set the pumpkin down in the middle of the market square with a satisfied smirk. "This year," she whispered to herself, "I'll be unbeatable." But as the day wore on, a familiar problem emerged. No one approached her stall. The villagers admired the pumpkin from afar, commenting on how grand and impressive it was, but no one bought it. A young couple walked by, staring at the enormous pumpkin. "It's incredible. We could eat for a year. But how would we even get it home?" The woman whispered to her husband. "It's far too big for our cart." Moria overheard, her face tightening with frustration. She couldn't expose her magic in public to shrink the pumpkin, and without a way to transport it, no one was interested. The crowds that had gathered to marvel soon moved on to other stalls. Meanwhile, Clever, perched on his usual stall, had taken a different approach. This year, he cut the pumpkins mid-growth because he was short on time, leaving him with a heap of green, unripe pumpkins. No one really ate them at the contest anyways, they mostly carved them. Moria's heart sank as she watched the villagers flock to Clever's stall as he arranged his pumpkins for the villagers to see. Moria knew in her heart she may still have a chance because all of his pumpkins were unripened. She walked over to browse his green crop when all of a sudden her radiant hair gave off enough light that they ripened immediately. Daniel Thorne sarcastically said, "I guess your magic does work, just not for you." Then all the townspeople came to see and left with their arms full of pumpkins, while her giant creation sat untouched, too impractical to be of any use. Her glowing hair, still blindingly bright, reflected her growing frustration, casting shadows of greed. Daniel Thorne wandered over and sat beside her, watching the scene unfold. "You really didn't think this through, did you?" he said with a lazy yawn. "Big isn't always better, and going over to your competitor's table isn't either." Moria clenched her fists, staring at the enormous pumpkin. She had poured all of her power into this one fruit, and yet again, Clever had stolen the show with his simple charm and practicality, with a little bit of her radiant magic. She sighed, realizing her mistake. She had focused so much on beating Clever that she hadn't stopped to think about what was at stake. "I'll win next year," she whispered under her breath, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Next year I'll get it right." Daniel Thorne rolled his eyes, knowing full well that Moria would never stop chasing the victory that always slipped just out of her grasp, and that next year would only bring another embarrassment. As the market began to close, the villagers made their way home with their purchased pumpkins from Clever's treasures. A newly installed signage above his stall that buzzed more and more every year. Moria stood in the square with her giant, unsold creation. Once again, she had been defeated, and not by Clever's magic this time, but her own.